Greetings, everyone. My name is Jim Barron. I'm a faculty member at the Yale School of Management. I teach in the human resources area, broadly defined, and so I'm really delighted to have the honor of hosting this webinar on the future of people analytics, a topic that certainly students these days are keenly interested in. We have three incredibly accomplished and interesting panelists. I'll just briefly introduce them, and then I'll be asking them in a minute to tell us a little bit about the journey that's brought them to their current role. Cliff Emanuel, class of 2015, is the workforce planning and people analytics lead at Google. Tanmay Manohar, class of 16, is vice president of people analytics and workforce planning at Paramount in New York City. And Julia Rozovsky, class of 12, is the head of people operations at Verily Life Sciences after spending quite a bit of time at Google in people operations. So first of all, welcome to the three of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. For two of you, it's fairly early in the day, so appreciate you starting your day with us from the West Coast. So to kick things off, perhaps each of you could tell us a little bit about how you're presently engaged in people analytics work, what that looks like, and how you wound up in that space. So Cliff, since you're on my far left, I'll ask you, would you kick us off?
Yeah, happy to. And thank you for having us on the panel today. So presently, as you mentioned, I lead our people analytics work related to workforce planning. And over the past several years, that's meant supporting our efforts around location strategy. So how we're going to grow the company and in making sure that leaders have the best available data when doing that, both internal and external market data, right? So looking at availability of talent, diversity in different locations, different regulatory considerations, but then also how much do our employees actually want to work in different places, and do we see preferences there? And so my team has been supporting the company in that way. We also work a lot on our company's flexibility policies. So for different segments of the company, what are the rules around required time in office, the ability to work from different locations, the ability to work remotely, and set up a process to have teams decide that in a structured way. In terms of my path to people analytics, my background's in management consulting. I think that's a very well-trod path into the field, but I always found myself attracted to issues around workforce development and kind of employment as a lever for social change. I spent some time in nonprofit management consulting at the Bridgespan Group. And so I've always been passionate about work and issues around workforce, and analytics is really just the angle through which I enjoy engaging in that topic.
That's great, thank you. You mentioned diversity, and I want to come back to that in a bit and ask all three of you to speak to that. But let me follow up on one thing. You mentioned the flexibility policies. Are you involved in doing research on the effect of those policies and trying to inform how Google thinks about its approach towards hybrid work?
I am not involved in the research, but I am a heavy consumer of the research that we're doing, as it informs a lot of the kind of advising that we do in turn to the business. So happy to speak to that.
Okay, great. Well, let's come back to that. Tanmay, maybe you could give us your overview,
Sure.
if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. And echo Cliff's sentiment, and thank you for having us. My day-to-day essentially involves running people analytics across the entire talent management stack. So I essentially work on recruiting, I work on workforce planning, I work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, compensation analyses, job architecture, performance management, employee engagement and culture, any vertical within the HR landscape. We essentially have analytics cut across that. So I run a central team that supports all of these activities across our global footprint. So across all of our corporate functions, as well as all of our brands, our Nickelodeon, MTV, Paramount Pictures, BET, Comedy Central, so on, both domestically and internationally as well. So I essentially run that group. How I got into it is a roundabout story. I actually interned with Paramount during my MBA at SOM. I was in consumer intelligence and marketing actually at that time. So I was doing a lot of marketing analytics, joined full-time in the social media data strategy group. And at that time, I was essentially working with our integrated marketing organization and working on a lot of different initiatives related to analytics in terms of how do we better reach our audiences, how does our social footprint better reach and engage our audiences. And when our executive vice president got promoted to chief data officer, he stole a few of us, started his own ragtag group of centralized data consultants. And as I started to work on that, I got to work on box office projection initiatives with Paramount Pictures. I got to work on culture initiatives when our new CEO took over. I got to work on a whole bunch of different projects across the company. And one of them was in the talent acquisition space. And it was specifically around how can we use predictive analytics in the recruiting process to standardize how we recruit and to introduce a kind of an audit in terms of DEI in that process. So as I got more involved in that, I started to get another request from someone in HR, which led to another request from someone in HR and another and another. And I realized that we didn't have a people analytics function. So this was about 4 years ago, give or take. And I convinced our chief data officer and chief people officer at the time, would you let me take a stab at starting the function? And they said, go for it. And so these past few years have really been not only about standing up the function, but now growing the team. And since we've been able to prove out our capabilities, expanding our footprint and investing more in data science as well.
Great. Thanks for that. Julia, how about you?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Rozovsky. I currently lead the people operations team at Verily. Verily is a Alphabet company, a life sciences company in the Alphabet portfolio. But as Jim said, I was at Google for about 10 years prior to that. I currently lead the operations teams at Verily. So people analytics is part of my remit, as well as our systems and technology teams, our HR operations teams, our shared services teams, our recruiting operations teams. So a little bit of everything in that touches data, technology, systems in HR. How did I get here? Honestly, I think it all started with Amy Wisniewski's careers class back many years ago, where we were doing an exercise, I think, on our reflected best self. And I kept coming up with this duality that I felt that all of my training was in math, and I was very quanty, and I just thought the only career that I could pursue was one in management consulting, and I should just go down that path and ride the quantitative wave all the way. But all of my interests were around people and people in the workplace and how organizations functioned and how teams came together. And it felt like I couldn't see how I could put them together. And it was actually, I think, at SOM and through conversations with Amy and other professors that she sort of pushed me to be like, there's this field called people analytics. Why don't you explore it, where it combines both of these areas? And that summer, I ended up interning at the people analytics team at Google. And so it sort of started there. And I joined right after business school on the people analytics team and rode my way around the people operations space at Google. So I started in people analytics. I did quite a bit of research on what makes for a great manager, what makes for great teams, research about well-being and wellness. Then I went into leading teams around talent analytics and attrition analytics, and you name the topic, we sort of did all the analytics on it. And then I pivoted my career a little bit. What I was finding was I was really loving the taking the data and influencing leaders and how they run their organization. And I want to get closer to being in a leader's ear, and using the people analytics to help them run healthier organizations. So I shifted into more of a HR business partner role, and then kept expanding from there. And that's sort of how I find myself here.
Thanks for that. I mean, that leads to a question that I was going to ask a little later, but I want to follow up on the last comment that you made, which is, you do these studies, you do these analytics, but at the end of the day, you need to convince people to pay attention to that work. What's involved with that? Has that been a challenge? And how do you ensure that the important work that you're doing actually drives practice in the organization? Julia, let me just ask you, since you sort of teed up this topic for us.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I say that to all of my teams, that we can do the best analytics out there, but unless we really understand what the business needs and why it's critical and how it's going to drive impact and are able to communicate that thoughtfully, it's just going to sit, on a shelf somewhere and not go anywhere. So I think there's a couple things that I think a lot about. One is that sometimes it's not the most sophisticated analysis that's going to be the most impactful. It's the analysis that is most core to the organizational issue that a leader is leading through in the moment, right? And so I think the first thing that I like to think about is, what is the business problem? Like, what is the actual business problem that has a people component to it, and trying to get as core and as central to that business issue with our analytics. The second is, once you've done the analysis, it's thinking about, how do I simplify this and tell the story in a way that people who are less quantitative, people who haven't been sitting with the data for weeks, can understand it, right? And that's about really strong data visualization. It's about really strong storyboarding. It's about knowing your audience and being able to talk to them. And I think the last part is about being able to connect to, what should you do with this information? Like, we've done the analysis, we understand your problem, we're trying to share it in a way that's very crisp and clear, and we have a perspective on what you should do as a result of these insights. And the last thing I will say is that repetition doesn't spoil the prayer. Like, it might not register the first time, and you have to be very persistent, and use your influence skills and use your network to try to get in front of the leadership team and repeat over and over and over until you persist.
That's great. Thanks so much for that. Tanmay, you were the entrepreneur that sort of launched this enterprise within Paramount. Has it been a challenge to sort of sell your insights within the organization, and how do you best do that?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Julia was saying really resonated with me too, because I try to look for burning platforms, things that are core, as Julia mentioned, to the business. So it's a lot easier to be able to share insights and share action plans when you know that leader is already bought in, and that if you're able to solve this for them, it's going to be a big win, for them too. So one of the things that I had started initially when I created the people analytics function was a DEI measurement infrastructure across all of our staff population. And we've, we're at the point now where we publicly publish all of our DEI data, which is rare in the media and entertainment landscape. But that was an area which was a burning platform for our senior leaders, more so, especially in the last several years, as we've had, the Me Too movement, the death of George Floyd, all of these, events and catalysts during the past few years to force companies to think more critically about how they're engaging in that space. And because we already had that in flight, it was a lot easier to get an inroad through that. And I think that's really allowed me to expand the scope beyond one vertical and start, then work with TA, work with compensation, work with other groups. The more that these other teams start to see that there's value in the process, the more organically they come to us with requests rather than me having to go and push it out to to our line leaders. The other thing is I also want to make sure that we're upskilling the rest of the HR function as well. So to that effect, I host trainings periodically on data-driven decision-making and business analysis for HR. And, it's using a lot of, what we learned in business school to help HR leaders understand how do we quantify the results and the impacts of our projects. And how are we use financial models to actually project out how much, money we might save if we do project A versus project B. And that's something that our finance counterparts almost fall out of their seats when they see that HR is doing a discounted cash flow analysis or something like that. But it's something that really helps us speak the language of our business partners and the language of our line leaders. So meeting them where they are, I think it was something I took from my marketing experience and applied it to HR in terms of seeing our business, our applicants, our employees as our customers in the ecosystem.
So it sounds like someone who wants to do this work, if there are students listening in, some finance, some statistics, and some strategy would serve you, quite well. Is that a fair?
It would definitely set you apart. I will also advocate for classes like IPD and strategic communications. I think power in politics is now part of the core. It was an elective when I was at SOM, but some of those more social psychology related classes are also invaluable because at the end of the day, you're trying to convince these very senior leaders, all the way up to the CEO and the board of the initiatives that you're working on. And yeah, definitely, Julia, negotiations and influence, mastering influence and persuasion was another awesome class. I highly advocate for those because those are also the skills that you can't practice in the workplace. You can go back and look up, finance textbooks and statistics and things if you forget. It's hard to experiment with your manager in terms of like, oh, this is a safe space and I'm going to say X, Y, Z.
Right.
You really get that opportunity in school for any students to be able to have that, forum where you can try out these things.
Great. Thanks for that. Cliff, how about your experience at Google in terms of selling your work to your colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Sometimes it actually has been really effective to segment the work and really protect the research component to allow them to explore and to look into avenues that might not yet have clear application. And then have a separate set of analysts who are more business facing, who can actually take those lessons learned and apply them. So for example, Julia mentioned the great work that she led on what makes a good manager, right? And I think when they went into that, they didn't know necessarily kind of what the answers would be, right? The outcomes from that then went directly into our evaluation tools for how we evaluate managers and reward them. So being able to have both of those perspectives, right? Both the pure research, but then also the application, I think is super important. But I really try to have my teams kind of look across the entire spectrum. And I think about this as like, made up like of 4 eyes framework, from the information that you're getting from our systems to the insights you're generating from it, to how you're influencing through communication, through dashboards, and ultimately how you're measuring the impact of that. And we're trying to get better on measuring not just sort of the people outcomes that come from HR, but also the business outcomes that those are driving, and create more of a through line from the HR work through to the business work.
Great, thank you for that. I'm tracking a couple of the questions in the Q&A. Several of you have referred to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I know that's a topic that just about anybody with eyes is interested in. And Tanmay, you talked a little bit about efforts at Paramount, but I'd love if each of you could talk about, in sort of specific terms, what People Analytics is doing to support diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in your organizations, just very concretely. Cliff, let me ask you if you would start.
Yeah, sure. It's vitally important to the work that we do in People Analytics. I'd start by just pointing to our company values around diversity specifically. We set out at a company level to say, we'd like our company representation of our employees to match the workforce in terms of race, gender, some other protected classes as well. Right? So that's kind of the vision that we had as a company. We couldn't really pursue that until we could measure it. And I think that measurement is where People Analytics came in, both in terms of measuring, hey, how do you actually measure the representation of veterans in the software engineering market, right? How do you really thoughtfully construct a self-ID campaign to understand the demographics of your own employees? And so just in terms of the goal setting and the tracking of the goals, I think People Analytics has been really, really vital. The other place I'd speak to is applying an equity lens on all of the different people policies and practices that we're implementing. So if we're going to put in place a new set of policies around work flexibility, around compensation, we just went through a round of layoffs at Google. Having measurement to understand whether those policies are disproportionately impacting one demographic in the company or another. So for example, we know that caregivers are more likely to work remotely than non-caregivers. And so making sure that that understanding is embedded in those policies and as we're engaging with employees in that way, I think is vitally important. So we have an entire team that's dedicated to equity analysis. The third thing I'll point to is the way that the People Analytics teams have been effective in not just reporting internally, but also externally. So we every year publish a diversity annual report where we report out on how well are we doing in terms of hiring, progressing, and retaining underrepresented talent at Google. And I think having that external view really helps with accountability when it comes to these issues.
Great, thanks for that. Julia, how about at Verily?
Verily and Google are, as you all know, very closely linked because they're both under the Alphabet portfolio. So a lot of the things that Cliff talked about, we are doing as well. I think concretely, there are a couple things that are bread and butter for People Analytics in the D&I space. One is, I would say, employee listening. So this is what I mean by that is all of our engagement surveys, all of the tools where we capture the employee voice. It's an ability to do a couple of things. We can ask directly about topics around inclusion and belonging and slice the data by every type of demographic to try to understand whether the experience at the organization is similar or different and why for different groups within the organization. So that's one type of analytics that is done and is really critical. I think the second, Cliff really talked about is tracking data around representation, progression, like promotion rates, performance score distribution, attrition within the organization. So just having a pulse and having a theory and goals around what you're trying to move the needle to. Then I think the fourth is being really thoughtful about evaluating the systems and the core processes within an organization. So for example, compensation, right? That is, we do a lot of pay equity analyses to make sure that we are compensating people equitably and that there are no statistically significant gaps by race, gender, ethnicity when you look at the data. So I think those are table stakes. I think any good people analytics group should be doing that. One of the things that I've been thinking about, and I haven't seen done well, but we're trying to push there, is when I look at all this data, a lot of it is around the outcome metrics, right? Like when you're looking, for example, at attrition rates, it's when people are leaving the organization and it's an outcome metric. But the impacts of bias happen way before somebody decides to leave the organization. And so what we're thinking about is, how do we go further upstream and use people analytics to understand how the experience of being in the workplace and the opportunities of being in the workplace might differ. So for example, your performance score probably is impacted by the type of projects that you get and the number of times you're called to be on a panel and number of times you're presenting at an all hands. And these are all small decisions that influence opportunity you have to perform, right? And so I'm trying to pull the team a little bit back to say, how do we start measuring those things so we can identify that there is an issue and course correct before we're looking at promotion rates and before we're looking at performance distributions, because at that point it's too late and all you can do is try to correct. So I don't have an answer. This is just a question that I'm thinking about.
So it sounds like this sort of relates to the whole issue of non-promotable work and trying to get specific about cataloging who's being asked to do what and how that might impact on their opportunities. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, at the end of the day, what I'm seeing is when you're looking, what we're tracking right now is the outcome measure, and what I want to understand more are the inputs that lead. Like by the time you're sitting and looking at promotion rates, and if you see that there is a gap, something happened before, right? That led to this. And so the question that I have for myself and my teams and for all of us is, what are the earlier signals that we can be tracking so that we can jump in quicker and influence our leaders earlier so we don't get to a point where we are seeing these differences in the outcome metrics?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Tanmay, anything you wanted to amplify on it? I mean, you talked a little bit about some of your actions around DE&I, but sure. I'm guessing that there's quite a bit more to it than that.
Yeah, we do a lot. I'll start kind of with our holistic approach and share a few specific examples. We, in the data that we look at company-wide, where, reporting based on EEOC guidelines, but we also have, I know there was a question in the chat, we also look at multi-ethnic, we look at gender identity, we look at veteran status, disability status, a number of other things that, we're not required to report on, but that we should be looking at. So we do have that functionality within our systems. What we do is we look at representation, we look at hiring, promotions, terminations, internal mobility, to the point of attrition being kind of an outcome metric, we also look at what's going on in 30, 60, 90-day check-ins for new hires to see, are there any issues that are leading to people, leaving, and can we stop those and plug those right at, at the onset, getting them access to the right mentoring that they might need, getting them access to, senior leaders within the company who can mentor them. We're also looking at, we work with a lot of companies around DEI and auditing our own work. So we 2 years ago started working with MLT, Management Leadership for Tomorrow, around their Black Equity at Work Inclusion Index, which we're now also looking at Hispanic equity at work. But that essentially, we get audited around representation, compensation, inclusive and anti-racist work environment, racially just business practices, and then also racial justice contributions and investments. So we're not just representation, but what are we doing around compensation? Are we making sure we have a living wage for all employees? Are we making sure that we're investing in Black-owned businesses? Are we looking at supplier diversity as well? Like the entire ecosystem. So we're not just focused on one particular aspect of DEI, but we look very holistically across the process, across the landscape. And at the end of the day, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So when we're making these adjustments, we're doing it for all employees, right? Another thing we work on is around our training. One example of where I use people analytics was we use a VR partner equal reality, where we actually have training where individuals go through like an onboarding experience, and they're meeting with managers and other coworkers in a VR setting, and they're seeing microaggressions, they're seeing blatant, issues, and you have the option to speak up or not, and then afterwards talk about, what was going on. And I've actually used our analytics to customize that experience for Paramount employees, all the way down to even the names and titles of individuals you'll see are the ones that are most common across the company. So chances are you probably will run into an environment like that or a scenario like that, and you'll know what to do up front, rather than, to Julia's point, like you get to the end and you're like, oh my God, I saw these things and I'm leaving now. And, it's too late. So, we look at all of these things that roll up. And at the end of the day, it's about, Cliff mentioned accountability as well, in terms of accountability and transparency. Our motto is really, what gets measured gets done. And our part of anyone at the company who has bonus eligibility, part of their business multiplier is tied to the company's DEI performance. So it is everyone's responsibility. It is not just the responsibility of the people at the top. So it's really something that permeates our culture at Paramount. We tell stories and we want those stories to reflect our audiences. And if that's going to be the case, then our employees, our cast and crew need to reflect them too.
Great. Thank you. This is, all three of you have given me a lot to chew on, and I'm sure our audience. I want to encourage the audience to think about questions that you have not yet heard the answer to, because in a minute I want to turn to the Q&A from our participants. But I feel obliged to ask one final question, which is that to some people, people analytics, makes them nervous. It smacks of big brotherism or encroachment on privacy, or objectifying people by reducing them to numbers. I hear, from students, a number of concerns expressed around privacy and ethics. What concretely do you do in your organizations to ensure that those kinds of concerns about people analytics don't rise to the fore? Or maybe they're not concerns in your
I'll say we're very transparent about how we use data, whether it's confidential, whether it's anonymous, whether it's confidential but not anonymous. There are a lot of these different different ways that we can collect data, slice and dice data. So we're very transparent about how we use it, and that we're making sure we're using it ethically and in a manner that serves the company and serves employees. The way I look at it is there's a reason why people is first in people analytics. We deal with a ton of large numbers. We deal with, spreadsheets and analyses and statistics, and it can be very easy, if you're not careful, to lose sight of the fact that behind all of those numbers are people's lives and livelihoods, and how they're able to engage with their colleagues, how, we impact the communities that they live in. So it's incredibly important that anyone working, in people analytics in my team, and hopefully the stakeholders we serve, recognize that that's how we approach all of our data. That yes, we are looking at, the whole company, but at the end of the day, these are individuals, these are our colleagues, and these are you, right? We're looking at our own data as well, and how we fit into the whole company. So it's incredibly important that layer of ethical use of data spans, all of the different parts of the the life cycle, both upstream from data collection and then all the way downstream to the end, where we're actually using and implementing that data.
And is there any oversight process? I mean, is there any?
Yeah, we have governance committees. We have an audit committee. So I actually get audited by our internal audit group whenever we do certain analyses and initiatives. So we do have a governance group internally.
Great. Thank you. Cliff, how about your work at Google?
Yeah, it's very similar. We also have what we call a people operations security team that is responsible for all of our data access and usage policies. And similar to Paramount, we do also run a quarterly audit of all of our all the people within Google that have access to our people data. And so I, as a people analyst, need to acknowledge the policy, need to be tested on all of our privacy policies. I have a review done of all of my files at the company, make sure that the data access is accurate. The other thing I'd say is in terms of access to the data, we have different rules for sort of broad population level data versus personally identifiable information, and also for demographic data. So each of those have their own access policy and guidelines, which I think is very important. And then finally, we have a very strict need to know policy. And so just in terms of who is able to access the data, like they need to have a clear business justification that's been approved by the security team. And any data access also expires after at most 6 months. So even if you needed data for one project, you'll need to re-request access. So we basically try to treat our internal people data with the same level of rigor and security that we do our external user data. I think is very important.
Great, thank you. Julia?
I don't have too much to add. I think you both nailed it. The only other things I'll say is that, yes, we are very transparent about how all the data will be used. We're very thoughtful about data privacy and security. And how we de-identify data, right? So for example, I'll give you if we ever do an analysis where we have access to individual line data, and you need that for statistical analysis, the first thing that will be done is the data will be de-identified, right? And at Google, the analyst is not the person who is de-identifying the data. We've separated that so that by the time the analyst receives the data, there's no identifiable information on there. So I think that's one thing. It's how carefully are you treating the data. I think the only other thing that I would say is that two things. One is we're very careful to share aggregated results and instead of individual results. Like what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand large themes, organizational themes, because that is what our leaders can actually action on, instead of finding individual cases, right? So what we're looking for is big areas that are not working, or big areas that could be more effective, and the incentive is sort of aligned to share more aggregated results. The last thing I'll say is that I think it's very critical in anytime you're presenting data to present the limitations of the data. Here's what we know about it. Here's what we don't know. We know we're seeing these differences. We don't know why. We know, like we have to be very, very thoughtful in the way that we are using the data to tell the actual story instead of the story that the leader wants to hear. And to make it very clear that at the end of the day, this is the information that we have, but the leader's job is to lead, and they make the call. They have to take the analysis. They have to think about it through a lens of, organizational effectiveness. And it's the people that are making the call, not the data.
Great. Thank you for that. So I'm looking at the question and answer box, and we've got a number of great questions, and I'm struggling to prioritize them because I think they're all great questions. And so it occurs to me that the obvious thing for me to do is put you guys on the hot spot as the practitioners. And so I'm going to ask each of you if you would just pick one of the questions that you see in the Q&A box that speaks to something that you're particularly engaged with or interested in. So if each of you could just address one question that you think is particularly relevant to you, that would be fantastic. Tam, ma'am,
Sure.
you seem to have looked at the questions because you referred to it before. So is there one there that speaks to you?
Yeah, I'll tie one back to something I said earlier, but the concrete examples, not specifically related to DEI, but I think this is an example of, we mentioned finance earlier, the interplay between different functional areas. One of the things that we did was, you might remember from your marketing classes, doing conjoint analyses, and from your finance classes looking at efficient frontiers. And one of the things we looked at just recently was actually for our benefits and total rewards. We sent a company-wide survey related to a lot of the different offerings that we have. Paramount really prides itself on having an extremely strong offering in terms of benefits. Including in certain cases ones that are not going to be used very frequently, are significant costs to the company, but for the individuals who do use that benefit, they greatly value that benefit. So we essentially did an analysis where we were looking at, all right, we have baskets of goods and baskets of benefits, and you need to choose between whether you think you would rather have X% raise or X% contribution from Paramount to your health savings account, right? All of these different combinations, permutation combinations of benefits. And we actually plotted out, what's the most efficient for Paramount? Where are we getting the most bang for our buck? Where are we delivering the most value to employees? And recently it actually changed the way in which we are now going to look at our RSU, our stock grants. So those types of things where you can combine different functions, different fields, different classes that you learned from, and find new ways of solving problems. That's really where I find, the most exciting part of people analytics to be. Is there a new way we can use, a class that we learned, or a function that we know about, to solve a DEI problem, or to solve a benefits problem, or to solve an engagement issue. So I really resonated with that question. In terms of getting tangible, there are a lot of things you can do where you combine different data sets, different functions together to find unique ways of solving problems.
Great. And Julia indicated in the chat that she's involved in something very, very similar. So
yes, I was just going to say, we're also using a conjoint for benefits design. Google has used it for compensation design. It's a great analytical tool, and also came out of marketing classes at SOM.
That's great.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks for that. Cliff, how about, was there one of those questions that caught your eye?
Yeah, so one of the question on what helped tip the discussion in favor of sharing DEI information externally, which I think it's a really interesting question. So I wasn't at school when that data was first shared, but I was here in 2020 when we made our racial equity commitments, and that was following the death of George Floyd and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think two things really pushed us to make public commitments at that time around growing our representation of Black leadership and investing in communities with significant populations of Black talent. One, having a chief diversity officer who was in place and kind of responsible for that work and kind of working on it leading up to that point. Right? So the work didn't start in 2020, right? It had been commencing for years. But the second point was taking advantage of a very tragic but precipitating event that I think opened a window and an awareness around these issues. And so I think just being ready for the moment, right? It might not happen today, it might not happen tomorrow, but having the data available, having the conversations around the goals, and then when you do have that moment to where they become very salient in the public eye, taking advantage of it.
Thanks. Julia, you want to pick one?
Yes. Okay, I was just looking at one that was around tying, how do we tie, where is it?
Performance metrics to hiring outcomes, I think.
Yes. How do companies effectively tie performance metrics to the hiring process? And most companies I worked for, consulted for, the two are entirely unconnected. Okay, this caught my eye because this is something we're currently trying to do. I agree, in most companies I've worked for, they have also been totally not connected. But one of the things that we're trying to do right now is evolve the recruiting KPIs that we're looking at. And one of them that we're tracking is candidate quality, essentially. Like how do we think about candidate quality? And in doing that, we are trying to pull in performance metrics, right? So we have signals on you have signals beforehand on the quality of the candidate, and then you have data that you can pull in afterwards on how is their manager rating them at the 30, 60, 90-day check-in, what are their performance scores, how long they stay at the organization. All of that combines can give signals on the quality of the candidates that end up coming in. And we are trying to tie that back to the way that we're thinking about our hiring metrics and also how we evaluate our recruiters, right? So it's definitely not the only metric, it's just a signal, right? So this is, I think this ties into the last question. Like if the only thing we were evaluating our recruiters on is how long their candidates stay at the organization, that would be totally unfair. But in aggregate, if we are seeing that a particular recruiter is bringing folks in who end up leaving within 6 months, and we're seeing this at a big scale, there's significant differences, something is going on there, right? And that's what linking those two things helps us see.
Great, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I wanted to come back to something that Cliff alluded to, kind of at the beginning of the session around flexibility policies. Every company that I know of is sort of struggling to think through its policy with respect to where work is going to be located. What role are each of you playing in your respective organizations in helping think that through? How is people analytics informing these decisions about the future of work and where it's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to the work that I'm not directly involved in, but as I mentioned, I consume a lot of the work of our research team that they're doing. They've done a great job of effectively segmenting the company population into sort of different types of distributed work, right? So either those who are in the office and co-located with their teams, those who are in the office and basically working alone, and those who are working remotely. And they're then able to look across those populations and see, hey, how do their experience differ when it comes to their level of productivity, their level of well-being, and their level of connection. And then also apply a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens on top of that. So, they've been really effective in just using the data to segment that employee into different populations, and then they're now reporting to leaders on, hey, like how was the experience of these employees different based on where they sit. And so, for example, we know that people who are people who are working remotely report achieving a higher level of productivity than those who are in the office and with their teams. And that can seem kind of counterintuitive. Hey, like why are people who are in the office feeling less productive? And so that's helped us inform, well, like what are the drivers of productivity in the office? Like maybe it means it's harder to get a conference room for a meeting if you're in the office, or you have more distractions. And so that's informing some of the policies around how things are happening in the office. And I think kind of it goes to one of the questions of sort of what data do I most wish I had that we don't currently have? Just better objective measures of productivity. We rely on a lot of self-reported data here, employees saying like, yeah, I reached this level of productivity, but I think to really understand the impact of some of these flexibility policies, just having a clearer picture, right? We depend on some things like lines of code and number of changes submitted to code, and it works for very small subsets of the company, but I sometimes worry that we're missing the forest for the trees here, where we can point in pockets to say like, well, this is working well, but the overall picture, I think we're still working on getting a full perspective on.
Great, thank you. Teme?
Yeah, we're similar to Cliff. We're not the team that's directly leading the charge on the future of work, but we provide data to that team who then makes the decisions using our recommendations. So it originally started at Paramount as a COVID task force. With that, I was actually providing data by taking information from the Johns Hopkins COVID tracker, mapping it to our own data related to where do we have the most at-risk populations, and then also mapping it to where do we have the greatest marketing and communication support, so that at the beginning of COVID, when things were really hectic and we had to manage our resources efficiently, that what I called a virality ratio, just kind of made it up from my time in marketing. But that really helped us identify where do we, deploy our resources the most efficiently based on what populations we have, who are the most at risk. That evolved over the past couple of years now to a return to office task force, and we call it return to office and not return to work, which a lot of companies do, because we're, people weren't, not working during the past couple of years. We're just returning to a physical location. So now we do analyses in terms of making sure that individuals have access to the things that they need, the support that they need, not only technology, but related to their manager, right? If they started during COVID, are they able to have the right interactions with different people within their ecosystem? We're also thinking about what we called boroughs, but like clusters of individuals and teams who work together. And as we're moving to more agile workspaces, are we making sure that we're co-locating them We at Paramount, actually, we went through a merger between Viacom and CBS right before the pandemic. So that was another layer of complexity in our, return to office and future of work planning, where we're also looking at real estate. We're looking at, how to effectively use the office space that we now are left with. So we're trying to identify what's the right balance, what's the level at which, people should make decisions about the days that they come into the office if they're in a hybrid model. It was a miracle that we were able to create content during the pandemic remotely. But there is something to be said for having that, creativity and those hallway conversations when you're in the office, and being able to create real, human connections and faster problem solving, honestly, than you can over Zoom sometimes. So we're essentially providing the data around that interconnectedness and the readiness of return to office to that task force. So we're not directly involved in the decisions that get made, but we provide the insights to them.
Great, thanks for that. Julia?
Yep, I think both Cliff and Teme brought up really good research. The one additional thing that we are looking at are outcomes. So I think companies are doing the best job that they can right now to, set policies with pretty limited information, I think, about really how hybrid work is going to work, or whether to go fully remote, so on and so forth. So what we're starting to do is look at outcomes. So the same outcomes that we're looking at for DEI measures, like performance rates, promotion rates, perf score distributions. We're also looking at grouped by whether somebody is working remotely or whether somebody is in an office, because that's starting to give us information about whether these choices are impacting outcomes that we care about. And we don't want that to be, the externality of the future of work decisions that companies are making.
Yeah, and then Julia, that actually reminds me, and I've been having conversations with our research team, not just about how those outcomes are different for employees based on their location, but then also within those groups, if there are certain pockets that are experiencing it differently, right? So for example, is your performance impacted differently if you are a new employee versus a long tenured employee, right? Does it matter if you have caregiving responsibilities or not? And so it's not simply like, hey, like one size fits all, remote is good, in office is good. I think there's a difference, even in role type, right? Maybe if you're a product manager, it's more vital for you to be connected with people in person versus, say, you're an analyst that can do a lot of more work independently, actually benefit from a lot of heads down time at home. And so, further segmenting your employee population within those groups, I think, is also kind of the next frontier of a lot of this research.
I'm aware that we're coming up to time. There's a number of questions I, very much wanted to ask, including Billy Marks's question about your biggest hurdle. But whatever that hurdle is, all three of you are clearly surmounting it, because it's clear from your answers that you're having an incredible impact on your respective organizations. I learned a ton and am incredibly grateful to all three of you for taking time out of your busy and hectic schedules to enlighten us about the work that you're doing. So on behalf of SOM, thanks to all three of you, and thanks to our participants for joining us. And that concludes the webinar.